The morning of my wedding was chaos. Not the bad kind, but the kind that makes you realize how much effort it takes to pull off a perfect day. My mom flitted around the house, adjusting centerpieces and barking orders at the catering staff. My maid of honor, Haley, spent most of the morning bribing me to eat something other than champagne and nerves. And James? James was the calm in the storm. "You're beautiful," he whispered as we stood in the dressing room, hidden away from prying eyes. "I can't believe I get to marry you." The ceremony went off without a hitch. The vows were heartfelt, the weather cooperated, and the reception was magical. Our first dance felt like a dream, the world shrinking to just the two of us as the music swelled around us. We'd hired a local videographer named Matt to capture the day. He came highly recommended, with a portfolio full of gorgeous work and a reputation for being unobtrusive. I barely noticed him during the event, which I took as a good sign. "You'll have the final video in 2 weeks," Matt said as he packed up his gear. "I'll email you when it's ready." 2 weeks later, the email came just as promised. I opened the link on a lazy Sunday afternoon, curling up on the couch with James to relive the day. The video was perfect. Matt had captured every smile, every laugh, every stolen glance. Watching it felt like stepping back in time, like we were there all over again. Then the package arrived. It came on a Thursday, addressed to me with no return label. Inside was a plain envelope and a small SD card. "Did Matt mention sending anything else?" I asked James, holding up the card. He shrugged. "Maybe it's bonus footage?" I slid the card into my laptop, curiosity outweighing caution. The first clip was innocuous enough. Raw footage of the ceremony from a different angle, followed by candid shots of guests at the reception. I assumed it was extra material Matt had forgotten to include in the final cut. But then the tone shifted. The next clip showed James and me during our first dance. It was a close-up, far closer than I remembered Matt getting. The camera lingered on my face, panning down slowly to the curve of my neck, the way my hands rested on James's shoulders. A chill ran down my spine. "Do you remember him filming this close?" I asked James. "No," he said, frowning. "That's weird, right?" The clips grew stranger. Shots of us laughing during the cake cutting, but with the audio stripped away, leaving only the faint hum of background noise. A close-up of my bouquet as I held it, the flowers trembling slightly in my grip. Then came the final clip. It started with static, the screen flickering briefly before stabilizing. The angle was off, like the camera had been placed on a surface and left to record. The room came into view slowly. Our bedroom. The bed was unmade, clothes scattered across the floor, just as we'd left it in the rush of wedding preparations. For a moment I thought it was footage of us returning after the reception, but the timestamp on the video said otherwise. It was recorded the night before. I watched in horror as a shadow moved across the frame. A figure, indistinct but unmistakably human, stood in the doorway, staring at the bed. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. "Turn it off," James said, his voice tight. My hands fumbled with the laptop, slamming it shut as my heart raced. We called Matt the next morning. "Did you send us an SD card?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" I explained the footage, my words tumbling over each other in a rush. "I didn't send you anything," Matt said finally. "Once I delivered the final video, that was it." "Could someone else have gotten access to the footage?" James asked. "Impossible," Matt said. "I don't keep raw files. I delete everything after the project's done." The call ended with no answers, only more questions. James insisted we call the police. An officer came to the house, his expression neutral as we showed him the clips. He asked the usual questions. Did we recognize the figure? Had we noticed anything unusual leading up to the wedding? Did we have any enemies? Enemies? We were two ordinary people. Who would do something like this? The officer took the SD card and promised to follow up, but nothing came of it. Life didn't return to normal after that. How could it? Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of my eye, felt like a threat. James tried to reassure me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted to the windows when he thought I wasn't looking. Then the second package arrived. This one was smaller, wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was another SD card, along with a single Polaroid photo. The photo was of me. It was taken from outside the house, through the living room window. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, completely unaware. The SD card was worse. The footage was taken inside our home, James brushing his teeth, me cooking dinner, both of us asleep in bed. "I'm calling the police again," James said, his voice shaking. The third package came before the police could act. This time there was no SD card, no photo, just a handwritten note. "See you soon." We didn't sleep that night. Every light in the house was on, and James stayed by the door with a baseball bat, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. The knock came at 3 a.m. James opened the door before I could stop him, the bat raised. But there was no one there. Only another package, sitting on the welcome mat like a final insult. Inside was a tablet, preloaded with a single video file. James pressed play, his hand trembling. The footage was dark and shaky, like the camera had been carried through the house in a rush. It showed us sleeping, the camera lingering on my face for far too long. Then it turned, panning slowly to the bedroom closet. The door creaked open, and the video cut to black. We didn't wait for the police this time. We packed a bag, got in the car, and drove until the sun came up. We never went back. The police called a week later to say the house had been broken into, but nothing was stolen. They found no fingerprints, no evidence of who had been there. The case went cold. Months later, I received an email. The subject line was blank, but the body of the email contained a single link. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. It was a live feed. The camera was positioned inside a house, our house. It showed the living room empty and silent, except for one detail. A figure stood in the corner, their face hidden in the shadows. They held a camera, pointed directly at me. I didn't tell James about the email at first. I couldn't. How could I explain that someone was still inside our old house, still watching, still waiting? He'd barely held it together after the last package. I wasn't sure if he could handle this. But the live feed wouldn't leave me alone. I kept coming back to it, clicking the link obsessively, staring at the grainy, flickering image of our empty living room. The figure was always there, standing in the same corner, unmoving. Sometimes I thought I could see them tilt their head, just slightly, as though they knew I was watching. James started noticing my distraction. "What's wrong?" he asked one night as we sat in our new apartment eating takeout on the couch. "Nothing," I lied. He didn't believe me. "You've been jumpy for days. Are you still thinking about the house?" I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Sam, we're safe now," he said. "Whoever that was, they're not here. They can't hurt us." I wanted to believe him. But the live feed told a different story. It wasn't just the feed. Other things started happening. Small things, easy to dismiss at first. A package arrived at our new apartment, addressed to no one. Inside was a plain black hoodie, just like the one the figure in the video wore. A neighbor mentioned seeing someone lurking near the parking lot late at night, but when James checked the security footage, it was gone. Erased, the tape corrupted. And then there were the noises. Faint creaks in the floorboards, the sound of something shifting in the closet, the occasional soft thud from the attic above us. "Rats," James said when I brought it up. "Old buildings are full of them." But I wasn't so sure. One night, unable to sleep, I opened the live feed again. The figure was gone. At first, relief washed over me. Maybe they'd given up. Maybe it was finally over. But then I noticed something else. The room looked different. The angle was wrong. The perspective slightly off. It wasn't the living room anymore. It was our new apartment. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse racing. "James," I whispered, shaking him awake. He groaned, rolling over to face me. "What is it?" "There's someone here," I said. my voice trembling. He sat up immediately, his eyes darting toward the bedroom door. "Did you see them?" "Not exactly," I admitted. "But I know they're here. I've been watching the live feed and—" "What live feed?" James cut me off, his expression darkening. I hesitated, guilt rising in my chest. "There was an email," I admitted. "It had a link to a camera feed in the old house. I didn't think it was important, but now it's showing this apartment." James stared at me, his face a mixture of anger and fear. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to scare you," I said. "Well, congratulations," he snapped. "I'm terrified now." James decided we couldn't wait any longer. "If they're watching us, we need to catch them," he said, his voice firm. "We'll set a trap." We spent the next day installing cameras around the apartment, hidden ones, not the kind you'd notice at first glance. James insisted it would give us peace of mind. But as the hours passed, my unease grew. It happened that night just after midnight. I woke to the sound of a door creaking open. For a moment, I lay frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I nudged James, whispering his name. He stirred, groggy but alert. "What is it?" "Listen," I said. The sound came again, soft footsteps, moving through the apartment. James grabbed the baseball bat we kept by the bed and motioned for me to stay put. "Call the police," he whispered, creeping toward the door. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone. The line rang once, twice, and then it went dead. The next thing I remember is waking up to bright lights and the sound of voices. "Can you hear me?" someone asked. I opened my eyes to see a paramedic leaning over me, his face lined with concern. "What happened?" I croaked. "You're safe now," he said gently. But I wasn't safe. Not really. James was gone. The police found the cameras we'd installed, along with hours of footage from that night. Most of it was unremarkable. Static shots of the apartment, empty hallways, and closed doors. But then came the final clip. It showed the bedroom, dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped inside. They wore a black hoodie, the hood pulled low over their face. They stood at the foot of the bed, staring at me for what felt like an eternity. Then they turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar. The clip ended abruptly, with no sign of James. The police never found him. They said he must have run after the intruder, chasing them into the night. But there was no sign of a struggle, no trail to follow. All they found was the laptop open to the live feed. The footage was still running when they arrived, but the perspective had changed again. This time it showed a dark room with concrete walls and a single chair in the center. James was sitting in it. The days after James vanished blurred together. Sleep was impossible. I spent hours replaying the footage, searching for something the police might have missed. A shadow, a sound, a hint of where they had taken him. The live feed link still worked. Every time I clicked it, the camera angle had shifted. At first it showed the old house, the familiar living room frozen in time. Then the angle moved to our apartment, recording the night James disappeared. But now? Now it showed something new. A dark room with concrete walls. I didn't want to believe it was real, that the feed could be anything other than a sick prank. But deep down, I knew better. The room was empty except for the chair, its wooden legs splintered and uneven. I stared at the screen for hours, waiting, hoping for some sign of James. And then, one night, he appeared. The feed flickered, and James was suddenly there sitting in the chair. His head was slumped forward, his hands bound behind him. "James!" I screamed, my voice cracking. I typed frantically into the email's reply box, begging whoever was behind this to let him go. The camera zoomed in slowly, focusing on James's face. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. For a moment I thought he didn't recognize me, but then his gaze locked onto the camera and his lips moved. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. "James, I'm here. I can see you." He spoke again, his voice too faint to hear. "What is it? What are you saying?" I pleaded. His eyes widened suddenly, and he shook his head, struggling against the ropes that bound him. His lips formed two clear words, repeated over and over. "Run. Sam, run." The camera cut to static, and when it came back, the room was empty. I sat frozen, my fingers trembling over the keyboard. Before I could think of what to do next, the feed changed again. This time, it showed me. The view was from behind, angled over my shoulder. I could see myself sitting at the desk, staring at the laptop. I whipped around, my eyes darting across the room, but it was empty. The feed flickered once more and the angle changed. Now it was facing the doorway behind me, where a dark figure stood. I didn't think. I grabbed the laptop and bolted, running out of the apartment into the hallway. The stairs felt endless, my bare feet slipping on the cold concrete. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot, gasping for air. The lot was deserted, the night deathly quiet. I fumbled with my keys, finally unlocking the car and climbing inside. I shoved the laptop into the passenger seat and started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As I pulled out onto the empty street, I felt the crushing weight of relief. The road was a blur, and my thoughts raced faster than the car ever could. The image of James in that chair, the camera shifting to the figure behind me, I couldn't shake it. I stopped at a motel somewhere off the highway, the neon sign flickering vacancy like a heartbeat. The room smelled faintly of mildew, but I didn't care. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and placed the laptop on the bed. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, waiting for the feed to change again. It didn't. The dark room stayed empty, the chair sitting in the center like a throne of despair. I shouldn't have opened the laptop. I should have smashed it, burned it, thrown it into the woods. But I couldn't let go. James was out there somewhere, and this was my only connection to him. I clicked the reply box, my fingers trembling as I typed. "What do you want?" The message sent, and for a long time nothing happened. And then the feed changed. The camera showed the motel room. My motel room. It was positioned outside the window, zooming in on the cheap curtains fluttering in the breeze from the air conditioner. My stomach lurched as the view shifted, moving slowly toward the door. I scrambled off the bed, pressing my back against the far wall. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I stared at the door, waiting for the inevitable knock. But no one knocked. The feed flickered again. This time it was inside the room, the angle pointed directly at me. I stared at the screen, paralyzed. My own face stared back, wide-eyed and pale. And then I saw it, movement in the corner of the frame. A figure stepped into view, wearing the same black hoodie. They stood behind me, their face hidden in shadow, and raised a hand. I turned, my body moving before my mind could catch up. The room was empty. When I turned back to the laptop, the feed was gone. The screen showed nothing but static, the sound hissing like white noise in my ears. I closed the laptop, shoved it into my bag, and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, the night around me eerily silent. I locked the doors, gripping the steering wheel as tears streamed down my face. And then my phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number. "Look in the trunk." I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed to leave, to drive as far as I could and never look back. But I had to know. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin. My feet felt like lead as I walked to the back, my heart pounding in my chest. The trunk was already ajar, the latch barely holding it closed. I lifted it slowly, the metal groaning in protest. Inside was James. He was bound and gagged, his face bruised, his eyes wide with terror. "James!" I choked out, my voice trembling as I leaned into the trunk. His wide, frantic eyes darted toward something behind me. "Shh," came a voice, low and calm, just over my shoulder. I froze. The sound of my own breathing drowned out everything else. My mind raced, weighing options that felt non-existent. Adrenaline surged. I spun, my elbow connecting with something solid, a shoulder maybe, and I bolted for the driver's seat. The figure stumbled but recovered quickly, their heavy boots pounding against the asphalt as they chased me. I threw myself into the car, locking the doors and slamming the gear into reverse. The figure lunged, their hands slapping against the window, but the car surged backward, the tires screeching on the pavement. "Hold on," I shouted to James, though I wasn't sure if he could hear me. I yanked the wheel, spinning the car into a wild turn before slamming it into drive and hitting the gas. The figure disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. The miles blurred together as I drove, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. James groaned in the trunk, the sound muffled but unmistakable. I needed to stop, to get him out, but every shadow along the roadside felt like a trap. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found a deserted stretch of road and pulled over. "Hang on," I whispered, my voice cracking as I opened the trunk. James blinked up at me, his face pale and streaked with blood. I fumbled with the ropes, my hands trembling so badly it took longer than it should have. When he was free, he collapsed against me, his breath ragged. "Sam," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "We have to keep moving." We didn't stop again until sunrise. The small diner off the highway was nearly empty, the smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air. James and I sat in a corner booth, our backs to the wall, our eyes on the door. "What happened?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James stared at his hands, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. "I don't know," he said. "One minute I was chasing them out of the apartment, and the next, I woke up in the trunk." His words didn't explain much, but his haunted expression told me enough. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to scare us. They wanted control. "We have to go to the police," I said. James nodded, but there was hesitation in his eyes. The police station was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The officer who took our statement was kind but skeptical, his expression tightening as we described the packages, the footage, the figure in the hoodie. "We'll look into it," he promised, but his tone suggested otherwise. Hours later, we returned to the diner parking lot, only to find something waiting for us on the car's windshield, a small, neatly wrapped package. James and I exchanged a glance, dread pooling in my stomach. "Don't," he said, his voice firm. "We'll give it to the police." But I couldn't stop myself. My hands moved on their own, tearing at the paper as James protested. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed the two of us sitting in the diner, the photo taken just moments before. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice shaking. James nodded, his jaw clenched. "Then we go somewhere they can't find us." We packed what little we had and drove. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. We avoided using credit cards, changed our phone numbers, and left no forwarding address. At first, the paranoia was unbearable. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car on the road felt like a threat. But as time passed, the fear dulled, replaced by cautious hope. We settled in a small cabin in the mountains, miles from the nearest town. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, and for the first time in months, we felt safe. Everything went quiet after that. We never heard anything. The police investigations are still ongoing,